The ancient Egyptians built the Great Pyramid of Giza, a monument so massive that experts still debate how it was even constructed. The Greeks carved realistic sculptures and raised temples like the Parthenon that, despite centuries of disaster and destruction, still stand today. And the Maya created a calendar so advanced that many people believed it predicted the apocalypse. According to everything we've been taught, these cultures were the pinnacle of the ancient world. But what if they weren't the first? From the megalithic stone walls of Russia to the ancient rock art of Venezuela, archaeologists have discovered evidence that suggests human history may be far older than we've been led to believe. So, where does the story of mankind really start? What existed before recorded history? And are we only seeing the survivors of a much older world? The forgotten cultures of pre-dynastic Egypt before the Great Pyramids of Giza and pharaohs like King Tutankhamun or Ramses the Great ruled Egypt. The Nile Valley was shaped by a diverse range of pre-dynastic cultures that laid the foundations of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. But the deeper archaeologists look into this period of Egypt, the stranger and more mysterious the story becomes. The accepted timeline tells us that ancient Egypt emerged around 3100 BC, when the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were unified. But thousands of years before that even happened, communities were already farming the Nile, raising livestock, producing pottery, and establishing permanent settlements across the region. At sites like Fayum and Merimde, evidence shows agricultural societies thriving as early as 5500 BCE. Farther south, the Badarian culture left behind finely crafted black-topped pottery, ivory ornaments, and some of the earliest copper objects ever found in Egypt. By 4000 BC, the Naqada cultures were expanding trade routes hundreds of miles beyond the Nile Valley, exchanging goods with neighboring regions and building ceremonial centers long before the first dynasties appeared. But there is a problem. Between 9000 and 6000 BC, the archaeological record becomes surprisingly thin. We mean 3000 years of human activity seem to fade into scattered clues. Then, almost suddenly, very advanced communities began appearing along the Nile with established farming practices, specialized craftsmanship, organized trade, and complex burial traditions. The question is not whether these cultures existed. Their tools, settlements, graves, and artwork remain buried across Egypt. The question is how much of their story has disappeared. Because when the civilization that built the pyramids finally emerged, it may not have been the beginning of the Egyptian story at all. It may have been the latest chapter in a much older and otherworldly one. Sanxingdui, the lost culture of China. The Sanxingdui was a highly advanced Bronze Age culture that flourished in the Sichuan Basin from about 2500 to 900 BCE. By highly advanced, we mean a society capable of making huge bronze sculptures, sophisticated gold artifacts, and artistic styles unlike anything else found in ancient China, or even around the world. But for most of modern history, its existence was completely absent from the story of Chinese civilization. The first clue came in 1929, when a farmer digging a ditch found several ancient jade objects. At the time, the discovery attracted attention, but revealed little about the people who had created them. Then, more than 50 years later, archaeologists made a discovery that changed everything. In 1986, 2 large sacrificial pits were unearthed near the site. Inside were thousands of artifacts buried centuries ago. We're talking about gold masks, jade blades, weapons, pottery, elephant tusks, and some of the most extraordinary bronze creations ever found in the ancient world that emerged from the ground. Among them stood a life-sized bronze figure, nearly 9 feet tall, along with massive masks featuring exaggerated eyes, wing-like ears, and facial features unlike those of any neighboring culture. That was where the accepted narrative began to crack. For generations, historians believed the cradle of Chinese civilization developed almost exclusively along the Yellow River. Sanxingdui sat more than 700 miles away from that traditional center, but its craftsmen were producing works of astonishing complexity around 1200 BCE. The culture looked completely developed, highly organized, and very distinct. Then the trail suddenly goes cold. The people of Sanxingdui left behind no written records that could explain who they actually were. Their city eventually disappeared, while flooding, shifting river systems, or even seismic activity may have changed the landscape around them. Archaeologists also found discoveries at nearby Vinča that suggest the population may have relocated rather than vanished. Whatever the answer, Sanxingdui revealed something historians had long overlooked and ignored. Ancient China was not built from a single source. It was a far larger and far older story than anyone expected. Gornaya Shoria, the gigantic pre-flood megastructure well. These ginormous stone walls in the Gornaya Shoria mountains look like lumps of naturally placed rock from a distance, but a closer inspection reveals something far more puzzling. Rising from the forests of southern Siberia are enormous rectangular blocks stacked upon one another with angles and edges that seem almost too precise to be accidental. The formation stretches for roughly 200 meters and reaches heights of nearly 40 meters, making it one of the most unique and unusual megalithic sites ever reported in Russia. The scale is what immediately grabs attention. Some of the blocks measure as much as 20 meters long and 7 meters high. Estimates suggest certain stones could weigh close to 1,000 tons. For comparison, that is several times heavier than many of the largest stones used in the pyramids of Egypt or the famous megaliths of Baalbek in Lebanon. Standing beside them, a person appears almost insignificant against the sheer mass of the structure. And that is where the real debate begins. Supporters of the ancient construction theory point toward the sharp corners, flat surfaces, and apparent stacking pattern as signs of smart design. If these blocks were shaped and positioned deliberately, they would represent an engineering achievement far beyond anything known from the region's recorded past. Geologists, however, offer a different explanation. They argue that the formations are the result of natural processes acting over immense spans of time. Cycles of freezing and thawing, combined with erosion and tectonic stress, can fracture rock into oddly regular shapes. Similar phenomena have been seen elsewhere across Siberia, although rarely on such a dramatic scale. But one detail keeps the discussion alive. No comparable formation has been identified anywhere else in Russia with quite the same size. Whether the walls are the remnants of a forgotten culture or a geological coincidence, they still challenge all expectations. The lost ancient culture of Venezuela when it comes to ancient discoveries. Venezuela is not the kind of place historians usually talk about. Unlike Machu Picchu, the Maya cities, or the colossal heads of the Olmec, the country's most intriguing archaeological clues remained hidden deep within one of the most remote landscapes on Earth. The discovery began inside Canaima National Park, which is a super vast wilderness that covers more than 7 million acres of jungle, savanna, rivers, and towering tabletop mountains. Reaching some parts of the region is so difficult that researchers relied on remote sensing technology, drones, and even helicopters simply to access the sites they wanted to investigate. But what they found was unexpected. Scattered across isolated cliffs, boulders, rock shelters, and river rapids were clusters of ancient pictograms painted in red ochre. At first sight, many appeared little more than faded marks on stone. But after digital enhancement, a much larger picture emerged. Archaeologists identified at least 20 separate sites, displaying the same distinctive symbols: dots, crosses, ladder-like designs, geometric patterns, leaves. And humans appeared repeatedly across the landscape. That repetition caught experts' eyes. The artwork seemed connected by a shared visual language, suggesting that these locations belonged to a single cultural tradition, rather than unrelated groups leaving random markings behind. Some specialists now believe Canaima may have been the center of an ancient culture that influenced neighboring regions of Brazil, Colombia, and the Guianas. The age of the sites is still being investigated, although similar rock art elsewhere in South America has been linked to the Archaic period, stretching back thousands of years. The locations themselves add another layer to the mystery. Several panels were painted high above the ground, requiring considerable effort to reach, while others overlooked valleys that offered sweeping views of the surrounding terrain. After 15 years of research, archaeologists have reached a remarkable conclusion. These paintings may not simply be artwork. They could be the surviving fingerprints of a forgotten culture whose influence once extended far beyond the mountains of Venezuela. The Clovis culture of ancient America, the Clovis people, are one of the earliest prehistoric cultures in North America. But it's not the age that makes them remarkable. It's how suddenly they appear. Across vast stretches of the continent, archaeologists kept finding the same distinctive stone spear points buried beneath ancient soil layers, often alongside the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and other giant animals that once roamed Ice Age America. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Somehow, a single culture had spread across an enormous landscape more than 13,000 years ago. The discoveries first emerged during the 1920s and 1930s near Clovis, where the culture would eventually receive its name. What followed transformed the study of early American history. Those carefully crafted fluted spear points began appearing hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles apart, suggesting a population capable of moving across territories on a scale previously thought impossible for the period. But the stone tools tell only part of the story. Scientists conducted genetic studies on ancient remains, including the burial of a 2-year-old child discovered in Montana in 1968, which revealed connections stretching far beyond North America. Researchers found strong ancestral links between the Clovis population and indigenous peoples living across the Americas today, as well as distant ties to populations from Northeast Asia. The findings strengthened the theory that some of the first Americans crossed into the continent during the last ice age. But another mystery remains. For a culture that once left traces from coast to coast, the Clovis identity seems to dissolve surprisingly quickly from the archaeological record. Shifting climates, changing ecosystems, and the disappearance of many large Ice Age animals may have transformed the world they depended upon. Whatever actually happened, the Clovis people left behind more than stone points. They left behind some of the earliest and clearest evidence of human societies shaping the history of an entire continent. The mysterious ancient Bell Beaker culture, the Beaker culture, or the Bell Beaker culture, stands as one of the most intriguing movements of people in prehistoric Europe. Their name comes from a distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessel, yet those decorated cups are only the smallest part of a much larger story. Within a very short period, traces of this culture appeared across an astonishing area stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe, the British Isles, and beyond. Archaeologists place their rise around 2800 BC, during the opening stages of Europe's Bronze Age. Well, wherever they appeared, familiar patterns followed. Similar pottery styles, burial customs, metalworking traditions, and cultural practices began showing up across regions separated by mountains, rivers, and vast distances. The spread was so extensive that researchers still debate whether they were migrating populations, powerful cultural influences, or a combination of both. Britain offers one of the most fascinating examples. Around 2400 BC, communities associated with the Bell Beaker tradition arrived on the islands at roughly the same time Stonehenge was undergoing some of its biggest transformations. Recent DNA studies suggest that within only a few centuries, the genetic landscape of Britain changed dramatically. Evidence indicates that a large proportion of the earlier Neolithic population was replaced by groups connected to the Beaker phenomenon. That discovery raised a difficult question. How did a culture that emerged thousands of miles away manage to expand across so much of Europe while leaving behind remarkably similar traditions? Ancient Na points toward populations linked to the Rhine-Meuse region of present-day Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, yet the scale of their influence remains extraordinary. By around 1800 BC, the Bell Beaker identity had largely faded from the historical record. Their pottery remained, their graves remained, their genetic legacy remained. But the culture itself seemed to merge into the societies that followed, leaving behind one of the clearest examples of how entire populations can reshape history and then quietly disappear into it. Vinča, the cradle of European civilization. When people picture the world's earliest cultures, their minds usually travel to the deserts of Egypt or the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Only a few would expect one of the most surprising chapters of human history to begin in the Balkans more than 7,000 years ago. But that is exactly where archaeologists found the remains of the Vinča culture. Spread across large areas of southeastern Europe between roughly 5400 and 4500 BC. The Vinča people were building substantial settlements at a time when much of the continent was still occupied by small farming communities. Some of their settlements covered dozens of acres and remained occupied for generations, creating communities far larger than many researchers once believed possible for the Neolithic period. But the size of their settlements is only part of the story. Excavations have found evidence of copper working that may predate similar developments elsewhere in Europe by centuries. Finely crafted figurines, carefully planned houses, specialized workshops, and long-distance trade networks point toward a society with a surprising degree of organization. The deeper researchers dug, the more difficult it became to view these communities as simple farming villages. Then there are the symbols, carved into pottery, etched onto tablets, and scattered across many sites are hundreds of markings whose purpose is still debated. Some resemble abstract signs. Some of them look repeated often enough to suggest a shared system of communication. Whether they represent ownership marks, religious symbols, accounting records, or something far more complex, remains one of the most intriguing questions surrounding the culture. And that question carries enormous implications. Because if those markings truly represent an early form of writing, then one of humanity's most important breakthroughs may have appeared in Europe long before the first pharaoh ruled Egypt or the first Sumerian cities reached their height. Then, around 4500 BCE, the settlements, symbols, and traditions that define the Vinča world began to disappear. What remains is a culture that seems to arrive centuries ahead of its time, leaving behind clues that continue to challenge the story of how culture began. The Nok, the culture that changed Africa forever long before the rise of famous African kingdoms such as Ghana, Mali, or Songhai. Another culture was already flourishing across the grasslands of present-day Nigeria. But unlike those later civilizations, the Nok left behind no written history, no named rulers, and no surviving monuments explaining who they were. Instead, they left faces. We mean hundreds of them. Emerging from the soil were terracotta sculptures, unlike anything previously discovered in West Africa. Some depicted men, others portrayed women. Many featured elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, and carefully detailed expressions. Their eyes were often triangular, their pupils pierced through the clay, giving them an appearance that felt strangely alive despite being more than 2,000 years old. The craftsmanship immediately raised questions. Creating sculptures of this size and complexity required skilled artisans, organized communities, and traditions passed down through generations. But the Nok were doing this as early as 1500 BA, making them one of the oldest known cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. Their achievements extended beyond art. Evidence suggests Nok communities were among the earliest people in the region to work iron on a significant scale. Long before many neighboring societies adopted the tech, they were producing tools capable of transforming agriculture, craftsmanship, and daily life. Settlements spread across a large area of northern Nigeria, indicating a culture that endured for centuries. Then the picture becomes surprisingly difficult to follow. Around 500 C, the familiar traces of Nok society began disappearing from the archaeological record. Their distinctive sculptures become scarce. Their settlements fade. The culture that had flourished for nearly 2,000 years slowly slips from view. But the clay figures remain, and each one seems to hint at the same possibility. By the time recorded history reached this part of Africa, entire chapters of the story had already been written, lived, and forgotten. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you soon.